Hey guys, welcome on in to today's video. If you're interested in getting more political forecast analysis and commentary, you can click that subscribe button. In this one, we're just going to be doing kind of a fun hypothetical matchup here if Trump and Pence were to go head-to-head in the 2020 Republican primary. And basically, whoever we see winning the popular vote in these states, we're just going to give them all of the electoral college votes. It would be way too complicated to divvy out all of the different delegates and things like that going through the Republican primary process, but still, we're going to have Trump getting the blue states, Pence getting the red states, and the information that we're going to use for this is using the 2016 Republican primary results. We see a lot of crossover between Ted Cruz voters and potential Mike Pence voters, and also we're going to be using the religiosity of these particular states, with Mike Pence being very popular amongst the Christian voting bloc of the Republican Party. Part of the reason why Trump was able to get over the finish line and win the presidency is the fact that he picked Mike Pence to get those evangelical voters in particular. So the more religious an area is, definitely the better chance that Mike Pence would have of winning those states as well. So we're just going to move our way, starting out west and then moving over to the east. We're going to go through state by state, divvying out these votes to either Trump or Pence. So we're going to start out in Hawaii. This is an area, it was a pretty competitive matchup between Trump and Cruz. Trump not getting over 50% of the vote, but still coming through in the state of Hawaii and winning it overall. So we're going to go ahead and continue to give that over to Donald Trump. Also, not the most religious area, certainly by any means. So that also plays into Trump's favor a little bit. Moving up to Alaska, Ted Cruz was able to win the state of Alaska, the majority of the vote there. We think that that would have crossover with Pence, so we're going to make that red. And then we're going to kind of give a swath of states here over to Trump based on how he did in the primaries, and also the fact that the West Coast isn't the most religious, which also helps out Donald Trump a bit, getting more so of those voters and not having Christians and evangelical Christians going to Mike Pence's side. So in particular, Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada all play into that scenario. Now moving over to Idaho and Utah, a little bit more religious of areas, also states where Ted Cruz was able to have a lot of success in during the 2016 primaries. As you can see by the yellow color on the primary map up in the upper right-hand corner, the yellow result is Ted Cruz doing well, the blue result is Donald Trump, and then red, Marco Rubio, and the kind of aqua green, that's going to be John Kasich. The map below that, the darker the state is, the more religious it is. So the lighter it is, the less religious it is. So we're going to give Idaho, Utah, and then also Wyoming, Colorado, and Kansas. Also, all of these states, Ted Cruz did very well in. Donald Trump not doing hot at all, especially for whatever reason in this part of the country, not doing such a great job over there, with Ted Cruz really dominating things and getting a lot of the delegates back in the 2016 Republican primary. But moving up to Montana, not quite as religious as some of these other states that I just went through. And also Donald Trump did amazingly well, almost getting like 75% of the vote there in the 2016 Republican primary. So that's going to go over to his side. Arizona, another area where Trump did very well in, getting nearly 50% of the vote. His border rhetoric really playing over there, especially in the Republican primary. And then also New Mexico, an area where Trump did very well. In Arizona and New Mexico, still religious, but maybe not quite as religious as Utah, maybe Wyoming, Idaho, those states in particular. Moving on over to Texas, not a lot of love here in this state for Trump. It's kind of a love-hate relationship. He didn't do exceedingly well in the 2016 general election against Clinton, winning by less than 10 percentage points. And then, of course, Ted Cruz taking care of business there, winning his home state, but we see a lot of crossover there with those voters that would go for Pence. And then also the hate that's between the Bush family and the Trumps, that also doesn't play very well for Trump in the state of Texas. So we're going to give that over to Mike Pence. And then moving up to Oklahoma, another state where Ted Cruz was able to come through and win in terms of the overall vote in that state. So we're going to give that to Pence as well. And now moving up, it's kind of interesting. Usually we see kind of a uniform situation throughout the Great Plains, depending on whatever election that we are in, but that wasn't necessarily the case here in the 2016 Republican primary, where Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, these states going over to Ted Cruz in terms of the popular vote, but Nebraska, South Dakota, and North Dakota overwhelmingly going for Donald Trump for whatever reason that might be. Usually we see some more uniformity in these states, but that wasn't the case here. So we're going to give these over to Donald Trump, expecting him to continue to do well, where he got well over 50% of the votes in these states. Now moving on to Minnesota, one of the worst states that Trump competed in. He got third place behind Cruz and Marco Rubio. So we think that that would continue to play here, giving that over to Mike Pence. Now moving on to the state of Iowa, an extremely interesting situation there in the Republican primary in 2016. It was basically almost exactly a four-way race. It could have gone either way between Kasich, Rubio, Cruz, and Trump. Very competitive. And we see especially the Christian evangelical vote in a state like Iowa would definitely play well for a guy like Cruz. He was also able to basically just go lockstep there with Donald Trump in the state of Iowa as well. And also Kasich and Rubio voters, I think, would have more crossover to Pence than maybe they would want to go over and vote for Donald Trump. So we also think that Iowa would go for Pence. Also Wisconsin, an area where Trump did exceedingly poorly, which is another kind of weird situation, especially here in the Midwest. Some of these Midwestern states Trump did very well in, but some he did not do so well in. In a state like Wisconsin, he did not have his greatest showing by any means, with Cruz getting about 50% of the vote there over in Wisconsin, and 36 of the delegates compared to just 6 that went over to Trump. Now moving down to Illinois, it was very close between Cruz and Trump there, but Trump still coming through and getting the majority of the delegates from the state of Illinois. We think that this would be a very competitive race. Probably the rural areas of Illinois overwhelmingly going for Pence, and then maybe some of the more urban areas where all the population center is would go for Trump. Also, a bordering state to Indiana, especially right along that border, there'd probably be a lot of crossover appeal of Pence to the state of Illinois. And although we see it as being very close there, still we think Pence would be able to get a state like Illinois. And then, of course, Pence getting his home state where he's the governor in Indiana. So we see that going to Pence as well. And now we're going to be working through an area where a lot of these states are going to be going over to Pence. In the Southeast, the most religious part of the United States, all of these states that are in the upper tier in terms of religiosity, we're going to be giving over to Mike Pence. Even though Trump was able to beat Cruz in a lot of these states, I still think that Pence would be able to get a lot of that Marco Rubio vote, a lot of that John Kasich vote. So we're going to go through and give a swath of these very evangelical, very religious states here over to Mike Pence. Looking over on the map here, in the Southeast, pretty much a uniformity. We see these going over to a guy like Pence in comparison to Trump, even though it probably would be pretty competitive, still nonetheless giving them over to Pence. Now going down to Florida, this is an area where Trump did much better than expected. Of course, Marco Rubio, a lot of people thought he would be able to go ahead and win his home state. Wasn't the case. For whatever reason, Trump's message really resonated down there in the state of Florida. He got almost 50% of the vote, and also Ted Cruz not doing quite as well. In Florida, not as religious of a state as some of these other southeastern states. So we're going to give that over to Trump's side. Now moving up to Missouri, very close, basically a 50-50 between the amount of votes that Cruz got and Trump got. And also in this Midwestern area, we see it as being pretty competitive. Missouri, a very religious state as well. And we actually think the rural areas will kind of overwhelm the population centers in Kansas City and St. Louis and give it more so over to Pence. So we're going to give that to him as well. Moving on over to Kentucky, another religious area, a bordering state with Indiana. We see that cross playing over here to Mike Pence's side of things. So we're going to give that to him as well. Now moving up to the state of Michigan, this is a state where Trump's message on protectionism would really favor him, especially in a state like Michigan. And we're also going to have kind of a crossover conversation here with Ohio and Pennsylvania as well. Those blue-collar workers, they want those protectionist deals. And Pence, he's been more of a traditional Republican throughout his career and not caring as much about protectionist policies and a little bit more of a free trade situation there with Pence. I think that would play against him in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Also, 3 very important states where Trump was able to do better than your typical Republican is able to do in these states in a presidential election. I see that continuing to play here and having Trump have the advantage in these particular states. So giving all of these three important states over to Donald Trump. Also, he did pretty well in these states, of course, losing to Kasich in Ohio, but still doing pretty well against Kasich, getting second place with a large chunk of the vote in that primary back in 2016, and then also winning the Michigan and Pennsylvania primaries as well, getting the majority of the delegates from those two states. And especially the state of Michigan, there's a lot of evangelicals on the west side of the state and in these rural areas, but the population center around Detroit and the suburban areas around Detroit, I think, would overwhelmingly go for Trump in comparison to Pence. So that's also why I'm giving Trump the state of Michigan. Now, moving down to West Virginia, probably one of the easiest states to call for Donald Trump. He completely dominated Clinton in the general election, and even to basically even more of an extent during the Republican primary process, getting about 75% of the vote there. So we see that continuing to be the case there, especially with his rhetoric on coal. We see West Virginia going that way as well. Moving on down to North Carolina, where Cruz and Trump very competitive. And like I said, that Rubio-Kasich vote, probably a little bit more likely to go over to Pence's side than Trump's side. We think it would be very competitive. Trump was just able to get the total popular vote there in North Carolina, but with more of the establishment vote probably going to Pence's side, we see him being able to shift over North Carolina to his side. And then moving up to Virginia, maybe not quite as religious as some of these other southeastern states, still pretty religious depending on what part of that state you're in. But for whatever reason, Ted Cruz's message just did not resonate with the people of Virginia at all. He finished well behind both Trump and Marco Rubio, getting a very small percentage of the vote. For whatever reason, that Cruz message didn't resonate with these Virginia voters, and I think that would hurt Pence's chance probably in a state like Virginia. So we're going to give this over to Donald Trump. Now we're going to be working our way up through the Northeast, where you would generally figure Donald Trump would do better than Mike Pence. Not quite as religious of a part of the United States. And also, if we look back, Trump did pretty well in these areas during the 2016 Republican primary, other than the state of Maine, where Ted Cruz was able to get over and nearly about 50% of the vote there. So we're going to give that over to Mike Pence. But now working our way through here, we got Maryland, where Trump got over 50% of the vote in that primary, and then also Delaware, the same situation, over 50% of the vote. New Jersey as well, a state where Trump did very well in. It borders his home state of New York, so we're going to give him New Jersey as well. And then, of course, we're going to be giving Trump New York because that's his home state. He also did very well there during the primary process, and that just puts him over that 270 mark, up to 271. And I also feel like he's going to get a good chunk of the rest of this map as well. So we're going to give him, based on how he did during the primary process, even though some of these states were pretty close, being in the Northeast, where Trump is from, and not being quite as religious of areas, we see Donald Trump being able to win these states against Mike Pence as well. Kind of hard to click some of these small states. All right, and then Massachusetts. All right, and now we just have the District of Columbia left, and the District of Columbia, hardly any of the voters from there are Republican. It's basically as big of a Democratic area as you're going to see in the United States, but between Pence and Trump, really, they don't have a lot of love for either of those guys. This is actually an area where Marco Rubio was able to do well in, and Trump just getting such a small fraction of the vote, and Ted Cruz as well. They finished well behind Rubio and Kasich. It would be interesting to see how this would play out between Trump and Pence, but still, I think more of that establishment vote would go over to Pence, so we're going to give him the District of Columbia as well. So a pretty interesting map here. Trump just getting past Pence. We have 300 electoral votes on his side, 238 on Mike Pence's side. We could even see some of these Midwestern states potentially going over to Pence. If we were to give him these three important states here in Michigan, Ohio, and then that already puts him over the top, but Pennsylvania, it's basically the switch over there. That's basically the difference in this particular election, but that's how we see this playing out. Of course, a 2020 matchup in the Republican primary between Mike Pence and Donald Trump. Not very likely, but still not completely out of the realm of possibility. And we're just doing kind of a fun video to see how a race like this might play out. So that's pretty much going to wrap up this one, guys. If you have any comments, you can throw those down in the comment section. They will be moderated to some extent, so be a little bit civil with what you're saying. And that's pretty much going to do it, guys. So subscribe for more. We hope to see you in future videos. Bye.